Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. I know I haven't made a video in about 2 months, and I realize that that is probably too long to keep you all waiting. I've just been extremely busy with work, and now my school has just started, so I'm going to get busier, but I have some free time here and there, and so I decided I was going to make a video. But this video, as I'm sure you can tell by the title, is the continuation of my series that I'm doing on psychology, and specifically my examination of Sigmund Freud's theories along with Carl Jung's theories. Now, I encourage all of you to check my blog because I still post things on my blog. I'll write articles on my blog, and friends of mine have written articles. For example, I have a friend who writes for UC Davis, University of California, Davis, their Muslim student publication, and he did an article, and I reproduced that article on my blog, and the essence of his article is talking about critics of Islam, and this one guy, and I believe it was in Eugene, Oregon, who was going to teach a class on Islam, even though he had no academic credentials, and was basically, involved with the organizations run by such people as Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller, and he got fired from that position because, well, people who are bigots probably shouldn't be teaching a religion or a class on one particular religion, meaning Islam. But anyway, that's for you to enjoy on my blog. This video has hardly anything to do with religion, and is about psychology. And more specific is this book that I read called the Freud-Jung Letters. And I read this book a while back. It's been several months since I've read this, and it shows you how behind I am on making videos, which again, I apologize. Um, so what I've been doing is I've been reading to reiterate, and for those of you who are new to this concept that I'm doing videos on psychology, it is my major. It is the field of occupation that I plan on going into professionally. And I've been reading the works of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. So if you look into my past videos here on YouTube, you can see some of the other videos I've done and articles that I've written on my blog, which all go together. It's a whole series. I'll read a book by one of these gentlemen in chronological order in which they were written, and then I'll analyze that work and then give you my views on the work, either here on YouTube or on my blog. So I'm doing a video on this particular book, and I'll probably be doing a couple more videos in the future, near future, about some of the other books that I've written, because frankly, verbally, this stuff's just more interesting to hear about than it is to read about, at least my summary. Um, so Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung were friends, and they were colleagues, and Jung is historically been viewed as one of the many students of Sigmund Freud. And they had a vast amount of correspondence, and I will say the majority of their correspondence is very much political in nature, and I'll get to what I mean by that in a moment, but also more about the psychoanalytical movement and the politics behind that movement. And they were both in charge of certain organizations that were all under this umbrella of psychoanalysis, and Jung was, he was running one of them, and Freud was sort of, seen as the de facto leader. And Freud is grooming Jung to be his heir and to inherit this psychoanalytical movement. And so very early on, they see eye to eye as far as it goes with theory about the neurosis and hysteria, and why people develop certain issues mentally, and how to resolve those issues, and what's the source of those issues. And Jung was a student. He had just received his PhD. He was a doctor, a medical doctor, and he began corresponding with Sigmund Freud. And he had done his own research outside of Freud's influence. He had read Interpretation of Dreams by Freud, but he was already very well established in his own community in Switzerland, with his own theories, which I've covered his first 3 and 4 volumes of his work on my blog. And Freud took notice of those things and seemed very interested that Jung was sort of, they were coming at the same point, but just in different ways. Freud was working with female patients primarily in Vienna that were, experiencing hysterical symptoms, and he was using hypnosis, and then he did talk therapy, whereas Jung was approaching people that were in a mental institution that he was working at in Switzerland. And so they were coming to the same point, but just on a little different path, 2 different paths. And they begin having diverging views later on. Like I said, the majority of this book, they're on the same track with each other, and they see each other as like a father-son relationship, and they're very good friends, and they're in agreement. The thing is that Jung, even early on, Jung couldn't accept that the majority reasoning about why uh, there are psychosis or neuroses or just usual mental illness, he could not accept that it all goes back to just sexuality. He had worked with mental patients, and this is the thing: is that Sigmund Freud did not have a history of working with people who had suffered from schizophrenia, split personality disorder, manic depression, and Jung had a much more experience in that field, and he would be talking to a schizophrenic patient, and he just couldn't see how what the schizophrenic was experiencing had to do with his sexuality or sexuality in general. And so you get this little by little Jung kind of expressing, wasn't there more to mental disorders and mental issues and sexuality? And Freud just kept saying, no, sexuality is, we must champion sexuality. It must be just sexuality. And it's all about, basically all about sex to modernize and summarize. And it wasn't until Jung had this idea that he wanted to study fairy tales and myths. And his reasoning for this is that this was an idea that was even started by another of Freud's students, where they had this idea that fairy tales and myths, and then, of course, Freud would later on throw in religious traditions, were unconscious projections into conscious reality. So, in other words, the reasons why fairy tales are the way they are is that they are, not only do they have certain, conscious moral implications, but there are unconscious elements that we sometimes don't even realize we've written into the text of a fairy tale or what have you. And Jung was interested in this concept, and so he began delving into the history of religion, mythology, fairy tales, was reading a whole bunch of scripture and Grimm's fairy tales and Hans Christian Andersen and many myths, and he was finding that if you believe that these tales are unconscious projections into a conscious medium, i.e., writing a story, that says a lot about our human condition. And what he found by reading these stories is that sex wasn't around every corner. You could read like Little Red Riding Hood or Hansel and Gretel, and you're like, okay, but where's the sex? And so Jung, that really convinced Jung that symbolism, as far as in the context of psychology, could not be satisfied by merely a pure sexual perspective. And you see this in his correspondence. He just keeps saying to Freud, I really just feel like there's more to the picture here. And the divergence happens when Jung begins teaching his point of view, which is not a purely psychoanalytical, psychosexual perspective. And at times writes refutations, and I've illustrated this in my article in his volume called Freud and Psychoanalysis on my blog, where he starts criticizing and takes a different approach to many of the things that were considered concrete to Freud's theories. And the biggest split, and I'm going to discuss this book in another video. The big split happened when Jung published his book Symbols of Transformation, or as when it was first published, it was called Transformations of the Libido. And this is sort of his manifesto, where he essentially just says, look, sexuality is just a small percentage of what makes up our human psyches, and that there's more to us than that. And Freud just couldn't accept that, and that was the severing of their professional and personal friendships. And Jung would continue to serve as president of some of these psychoanalytical societies. It was very awkward because it was obvious that Freud just didn't want to deal with Jung anymore. And so they finally split apart. And they both wrote 2 books at the point of their splitting apart. Jung would go on to write Symbols of Transformation. Freud would go on to write Totem and Taboo. And I'm going to talk about both books in their own respective videos. So I know that this was sort of a broad summary of this book, but if you can find this book anywhere, if you're interested, it is a wealth of information. There's so many letters in here that I couldn't do one video on it, but I wanted to sort of hit the highlights of their professional relationship as illustrated by these letters. And this just serves as a signpost for the divergence now of Jung developing his own psychological thought and theories, and then Freud carrying on with his own already grounded perspective. So in the next videos, look forward to seeing now videos specifically on Jung's theories and also what Freud was up to while Jung was writing his own new material. Thank you everyone for watching. Peace be with you all.